my eyes are not that good. So yeah, let's just go with the handout, and we will we'll work it from there, and hopefully you guys can see it there. Let me just say a few things about the book, so you can understand the background there. Um, Spending the past 20 years in urban ministry, 10 of which a little bit over a decade as a pastor of a great church in the heart of inner city Detroit. I tried to take what I experienced not only here at Biola, but what I've been experiencing interacting in the apologetic community over the past 7 or 8 years, and combine that with the work that I'm doing on the front lines and in the inner city in Detroit, and working with other inner city and urban leaders. And let me just say that the hope of the book is that it would be a bridge building project to spark a heart for Christian apologetics and a love, rather, a passion for Christian apologetics in the heart of urban Christians, but to also spark a passion for urban Christians in the heart of the apologists. Because what I found is that so often there is great work that's being done that urban Christians aren't often aware of, and the prevailing thought in the community that I serve and in other communities around the country that are dominated by ethnic minorities is that apologetics is a field of study that is not, in a practical, relevant way, answering the questions that are critical to our ministry and our life. And so being able to help urban Christians to see that apologetics has much use and relevance to the work that they're doing, to the mission that they're doing as part of it. But then secondly, I've developed all of these great relationships with phenomenal people that are doing great philosophical work and apologetic work, theological work, but really aren't wrestling with this big audience of urban Christians. And so hopefully I can bring these two together in some way. I try to make sure that in the book that I'm dealing with the practical task of answering the questions that you often encounter if you're doing urban ministry. Now, some of these questions are similar to the questions you find just broadly in Western culture that we're wrestling with in America today. But just because they're the same question doesn't mean that they're asked the same way. And I use, for an example, the whole issue of life, the battle over the sanctity of life, which is a chapter in my book. And one of the things that I make sure I bring in is the background that minority women, in particular African-American women, have dealt with over the history of their existence in this nation, of just autonomy over their body. And how much of a quest that's been just to be able to have freedom and autonomy over their own bodies. And now you try to bring a pro-life argument into that type of ethos. How do we do that without undermining this quest for autonomy over the body, while at the same time recognizing there's a different body there, and we affirm the sanctity of life of the unborn child too. So those are some of that's just an example. The book is divided into 3 sections. Number 1, the ethical questions or the ethical challenges to the gospel in the urban setting. Secondly, the religious challenges to the gospel in the urban setting. And then finally, the social justice questions. Because social justice, and I'm very excited that the broader evangelical community has begun to develop more of a heart for issues of justice, that God is not just a God of righteousness, but he's a God of righteousness and justice. And so this is really exciting for me. But justice has been really one of the main issues, main areas of a passion for urban apologists for many decades now. And so I try to make sure I deal with that, especially in the area of economic justice and educational justice. And then the religious challenges, we deal with religious options that are very attractive in an urban setting, but often don't get scholastic attention. Things like 5%ers and Black Hebrew Israelites and Egyptology. These are things that, for many different reasons, are very attractive, especially in the African American community, that we deal with head on in the book. And hopefully it will service you well, as well as other individuals who desire to do evangelistic work in the urban setting. So I'm very pleased and thankful, Scott, for the invitation. We got a chance to have a great event last night with pastors from LA, not the ones that are on TV, but a different group of pastors from LA. But it was a great group, and we talked about the role of the local church in community transformation, the role of the local church in also urban economic renewal as well. These are all critical issues as we talk about the advancement of the gospel. I'm not quite sure who chose the topic for this afternoon, but I'm thrilled to discuss it because my life is the intersection of three worlds. Number one, my pastoral love. Secondly, my love for business, having a business background, working at Morgan Stanley for years, bringing that into a pastoral work, and now working at Moody Theological Seminary, Moody Bible Institute. I get a chance to have a frontline view of the integration of faith, work, economics, theology, and mission, all in this wonderful laboratory called Detroit. And so it's an exciting thing. It keeps me very much intellectually energized. But this whole role that the academy plays in producing community transforming leaders is so critically important because we have the opportunity of pouring into next generation leaders, emerging leaders, frontline leaders that are coming to us for the development of their minds, but the hope I pray, is the practical application of that in a real community context. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about taking what hopefully is very exciting within the academic arena and saying, how do we make sure that we're producing leaders that have a deep commitment to not only the what of their mission, but the where of their mission? And I think that's a big part of what we need to push our students to do. And in real practical, intentional ways, if we're going to produce community transforming leaders, it is so critical that we not only talk about the what of apologetics or evangelism or the work of theology or whatever field that they're called to, but we need to also talk very seriously about the where. Where is it that God is giving you a heart for, and how do you contextualize? And so let's go into the next slide if we could. If you have your packets, everyone should have a packet. That first slide there after the title slide simply says this: education that produces transformation requires contextualization. So what we're really looking at here is how then do we provide an education that ultimately will produce leaders that are having a transforming impact on communities in which they serve. Now, last night, we wrestled with the question, can the gospel transform communities? Now, this is a real question for evangelicals to wrestle with because our methodology of evangelism predominantly is very individualistic. It is one-to-one, as opposed to Islam, which is highly institutional. So for Muslims, the thought of can we transform a city, it's really a no-brainer because they're going to come in with a mosque, a business, a school. They're thinking on a very institutional level. Christians, and if you're not a Puritan, we typically don't approach society that way. We approach society from the perspective of, can I win my neighbor to Christ? And so this whole thought of broader community transformation requires vision. It requires an aspiration that communities can be changed, a faith and belief that the gospel has done it before and it can do it again, freeing people from the cultural bondage of a fallen world. But it also requires this whole thing of cross-cultural adaptation. How do I take the static teachings of the gospel and adapt them and contextualize them to the community, the city, the neighborhood, the ethnic group that I'm servicing? That's what I'm advocating for, that somehow we have to make sure that that's infused in every Biola student's life while they're here on campus with us at Biola or Talbot. Our goal is to train leaders who can exegete both the word and the world they live in well enough to effectively apply the gospel to the unique concerns of their community. So this whole thing of this hermeneutic of Scripture, and how does that look when we're also talking about exegeting communities? And a lot of work is being done on this whole thing of how do I exegete the community that I'm in? We're going to talk about that a little bit today as well. In order to accomplish this goal, universities must remember the practical and prophetic benefits. So the practical benefits that we all hope for is that we will live in communities where there is a sense of order, where there's a sense of flourishing, where the ills that we find and the devaluing of life, the dysfunctionality of families, the bondage of hyper-selfishness and individualism, these types of things that we're seeing growing in our culture, hopefully those things will be combated. But we also have this prophetic hope that the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our God and his Christ, and that there will be a time when the nations will rejoice, the ethnic groups of the world will rejoice and be able to sing praises to our God. This is why we need community transforming leaders. We need community transforming leaders who can go into various areas, bring the gospel so that we can see these practical and prophetic benefits come to pass right before our eyes. And let me just say that part of this requires us as an evangelical church to tap into and reconnect with our history of running into cities that are hurting instead of abandoning cities that are hurting. And I think that if we're going to recapture any of our fleeting influence in this culture, that's going to be a big part of it. Because our history is that we ran into Rome when it was falling. When the plagues come, we run into these cities with the gospel. We're the last man standing, if you will. But unfortunately, when cities like Newark, New Jersey, or Watts in California, or Chicago now, or my city, Detroit, when these cities begin to crumble and blight begins to set in and violence begin to set in and corruption begin to set in, it wasn't cool to plant churches there anymore. It wasn't cool to have churches there anymore. And I think that what we need to encourage our students to do is to say, what better place to apply everything that you're learning than in a city like Detroit? I'm an unofficial PR rep for the city of Detroit. It is a beautiful city. It's a wonderful city. And I say that even though I know the challenges and all of the problems, but what a great lab, if you will, to apply everything that we're learning. But if the city is not Detroit or Newark or Watts or wherever, the most important thing is that there's a passion to take everything that's taught in the academy back to a real community. If you go to the next slide, in my survey of the evangelical Christian university and seminary world, there are certain schools that are doing this well. And I can name certain schools that are doing a phenomenal job at producing community transforming leaders, right? And I think Biola, especially after last night, is so well positioned to not just be a thought leader, which we already are, but to be a leader and an influencer and a major impactor on the communities that are not only local to California, but even broad, that students like myself, alumni like myself, represent and hail from. And as I talked to the pastors that were in this room yesterday, there is not only a respect for Biola, but there is a thirst and a hunger to connect in more deep and tangible ways. So I'm saying that there is a tremendous opportunity. But in order for this to happen, there are certain commitments that Christian colleges and universities make to pull this off. And I'll reference the work that we're doing at Moody just as an example of how we're trying to live this out as well. Number one is a commitment to transformational mission. I could have put vision and values. In other words, transformation has to be an intentional part of our mission, an intentional part of our vision. It has to show up in our values. And as you go throughout the Biola website, you'll find transformation used over and over and over again. So that's a win there. That's a win there. But our students need to know, prospective students need to know, donors need to know that, hey, we are committed as an institution to training, yes, again, brilliant thought leaders, but we're also committed to making sure we train men and women who know how to contextualize that into real life mission fields. Number two is a commitment to transformational faculty. The faculty, there has to be an expectation that this is not just a mandate or an encouragement that we're giving to our students, but the faculties are engaged in community work as well. And I understand the difficulty of this. I wrestle with my faculty every day trying to encourage more community engagement because of the enormous weight of being in the classroom. It's not easy carrying that weight of being in the classroom and then on top of that, let me get involved in the community in greater ways. But I will tell you, there's always a thirst in every community for the faculty of the seminary or the Christian university to be more engaged at events, to speak, to get involved, and it's great modeling for the students as well. And we all know that saying that we sell best what we have ourselves experienced. What we've experienced and partaken of, we can advocate for in a more credible and passionate way. So I would just say that faculty, you guys do a tremendous job, again, in the classroom, and your involvement in the community is desperately needed. And there has to be not only an experience, but an aspiration to be more involved, even before we actually get to the tangible practicals of how do we do this, and some are doing it great already, and I recognize that and applaud that. I think that collectively, the aspiration has to be, how do we get our faculty more involved in the community? Third, there's a commitment to transformational community service. And this has to be prioritized and incentivized. Now, at Moody, part of our DNA is that because we financially, we're a full tuition paid program where students have their tuition paid for by the generosity of donors, there's an expectation and a requirement that you have to serve the city of Chicago at least 30 hours a semester if you're a student there. And so for our graduate students who don't have their education paid for in the same way, because after all, they're adults, they can get into debt, we do still have an expectation that you would serve. And if you do get scholarship support in our seminary, there is tied to it a commitment that you're going to serve, again, 30 hours a semester with some community service agency. And I put down prioritizing it, but I also put down incentivizing it. And I would just say, as much as possible, tying some service requirement to scholarships. I know it adds on an extra requirement, and the admissions folks are going to have to pull their hair out and figure out how do we do this. But adding on that requirement, I think, is huge, and it sends a powerful message to the community that Biola cares about us. Biola is not just looking for us, looking to solicit us so that we can come spend our dollars there, but they care about how the training, how that training is being used to produce radical community transformation. And I think that's a powerful message, and it also helps the bottom line. We just recently received funding over at Moody for a new scholarship known as our Urban Scholars Program. And that Urban Scholars Program allows tuition to be paid for 3 years, assuming full-time matriculation, but in exchange, those students in Michigan have to serve in the city of Detroit. They have to serve, and we pick designated agencies, pre-approved, and typically these are agencies that have some tie-in already with the school, run by alum or some tie-in, maybe a board member is heavily vested into this agency, but it's a win-win for the community, for the institution, and also for the student. Number four, fourth commitment is a commitment to transformational student recruitment. And I would just say, and I don't think we have any recruiters in the room, do we? Well, I think we all are unofficial recruiters, right? So everybody's hand should have gone up. That was actually a trick question. We have a ton of recruiters in the room. But from that department, I would just encourage that if we're going to have produce transformational community leaders, a big part of it is being intentional to recruit leaders that are already doing great transformational work. Let me just say, a pastor was here last night from a large, prominent African-American church about 20 minutes from here who says, I've been thinking about finishing my MA, and I think I want to do it here. He's already doing phenomenal community transformational work, and now he's looking for a place to do his educational work. I just advocate that there should be some community leaders that are on our hit list that we are at least having conversations with, where we're saying, have you thought about getting training, and have you considered Biola? And I think it should be just that intentional. So student services and admissions and recruitment department, they play a special and vital role in this whole project as well. If we could go on to the next slide. Let's talk about what has to happen in the classroom on the intellectual development side. And I'll get to the bullet points there in a moment. Let me start by reading the paragraph at the bottom. The first responsibility of the Christian university to their students is to teach them how to think biblically about everything. Sound familiar? Nothing short of Christ-centered, compassionate, critical thinking will have the power to transform the communities they will serve. And I love this quote by Dr. King. What the world desperately needs are tough-minded, tender-hearted Christians. The world desperately needs that. Think about what he's saying there. He doesn't want people whose minds are mush, right? Can't think critically about the issues of our day, going along with the flow, accepting what mass media tells us. We don't want those types of Christians out there representing the church. We want Christians who have been well-trained on how to dissect arguments, how to think in a foundational way, philosophical way, engaging in the major issues of our day from a Christian worldview perspective. We're doing that very well. But he also says, what good is a tough mind if you don't have a tender heart? That only produces Pharisees, right? So we want to have tenderheartedness as well so that we can have community transforming leaders who have this weeping within their hearts, right? This burden with like Paul communicates as you read Romans 9 through 11, Paul's heart for his kinsmen after the flesh just is so overflowing in that passage of scripture. And we want leaders like that who say, you know, would to God that I was accursed as opposed to them. This burden that drives them back into communities with this intellectual rigor as well to say, hey, there's some worldview issues that are causing the problem. What I discovered in Detroit is that the problem was the worldview. The problem at the foundation of it all is that people were not operating, our governmental leaders were not operating, our educational system is not operating from a Christian worldview basis. And if worldview is the problem in the community, then worldview is the only solution. And you're not going to solve it just by building better buildings or putting more police officers on the streets. You're going to have to change the way people think and view themselves, God, and creation. And so that's the type of leader that we want to send back into communities all across the country. And so in the classroom, what we need to try our best to do is to make sure they're thoroughly furnished with both the hard skills and the soft skills that will make them an effective leader. Now, this is where I want to sound a little bit more pastoral. The hard skills are critical. The theology and philosophy, the history and hermeneutics, the social sciences where possible, languages, and obviously as we design programs and map outcomes for these programs, the balance of all of this is going to be different depending on what the emphasis is. But as much as students can be required to have some sense of combination of these two, we want to make sure that we're accomplishing that. On the soft skills side of things, evangelism. And how do I communicate the gospel in effective, contextualized ways? Apologetics, knowing not only how to answer questions the right way, but how to answer the right questions. And again, I think this is part of the failure of the bridge that has not been built between urban communities and the field of apologetics, is that oftentimes the challenge is not whether or not questions are being answered rightly. The question is, are the right questions being undertaken? And we have to make sure that we're training people to do that. And then the arts, drama and music. If you're going to do an urban apologetic, and this is an emphasis in the book, you have to liberate it from the classroom and allow it to show up in spoken word, in poetry, in rap. I'm telling you, rap artists and the Christian rap artists have done more for advancing the cause of apologetics in the urban community over the past decade than any other group. There's a great group out of Atlanta called Reach Ministries. And they not only produce great records, but they also do a phenomenal job. Oh, I got to change the slide there, sorry. They also do a phenomenal job of missions and outreach and evangelism and presenting these ideas in prose and rhythms that connect with the soul and the heart as well as the head. Leadership. You can't talk about producing community transforming leaders if you don't offer a ton of leadership classes. Leadership has to be offered. Somewhere in every program, there has to be a serious undertaking of the philosophy and theories and practice of leadership and leadership development. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's noticed that there is a deficit of complete leaders out there. There's a whole lot of partial leaders out there, and I want to get into how I'm using these terms and the distinction between the two. But I think one of the greatest things we could do is just produce well-rounded, create complete leaders who understand what leadership is all about. And then ethics, this sense of not disembodied ethics, but incarnational ministry. This whole sense of living out before the world our beliefs. I think the church, again, if we're going to regain any of our fleeting influence and culture in America, we have to take praxis just as serious as we take orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is important, it is critical, but so is praxis. And I just commend Sean. I was mentioning a book that he and John Stonestreet just completed. And what I love about it is this uncompromising commitment to the gospel and to getting theology right, but there's also this weight and emphasis that's put on praxis as well. We need both. Let's go on. Beyond the classroom. Although we're not obligated beyond the classroom, we should never underestimate our influence beyond the classroom on our students. And so here's what we hope to be able to do. What I pray in some form or fashion, either formally through wraparound services or informally through one-on-one engagement with our students, that we're going to help them to get strong in 4 areas that are beyond the classroom. Number 1, community exegesis. Number 2, collaborative leadership. Number 3, counseling and discipleship. And then finally, number 4, Christ-centered preaching and prayer. And that's, again, part of that you'll see in the classroom, but so much of that extends beyond the classroom as well. Let's talk about community exegesis, moving a little bit faster. Community exegesis is the act of surveying a particular city or neighborhood as one would a text of scripture in order to discover God's presence and purpose in a given geographical area. This practice should include ethnology, the study of ethnic groups and their interaction with one another. That's a critical part of community exegesis. Understanding the people that are there. Critical interpretation of scripture and communities require similar skills. Observation, the question of what do I see in this community? Interpretation, what does that mean based off of what I've seen? And then application, how now shall I live in light of the things that I see, not only in the text, but in the neighborhoods that I serve. Paul's survey of Athens in Acts 17 is an exemplary biblical model. I wish I had time to obviously walk through that. Everyone knows how important Acts 17 is to the apologetic and evangelistic enterprise. I submit that Paul identifies 6 things as he surveyed Athens. Number 1, the idols of the city. Every city has idols. Every city has idols. Detroit has idols. La Mirada has idols. Chicago has every city has idols, and it's so important that we understand what are the idols in that city. For example, if I'm going to Boston, right, what I know is your heritage is a big idol, being from a particular social class or heritage, lineage. That's a potential idol there. Intellectualism is an idol or a god that's there. So you need to know, or our students need to know, how do we identify the idols in the communities that we're going to serve in? The influencers of the city. You can't be a community transforming leader if you're totally unaware of who the influencers of the city are. So that's a very important deal. Next, the industry of the city. Paul identifies, hey, in Athens, philosophy was the industry. They sat around and thought of new ideas and wrestled with ideas. This is the industry there. And so we need to know, what's the industry? Obviously in Detroit, it's a real quick answer, automotive industry, right? What does that tell us? And so knowing that's the industry in Detroit, one of the things that I know is that there's already this built-in tension between labor and management. And it plays itself out everywhere. We're the home of unions, right? So when you're appointed as a pastor, understand your flock already is against you, right? They're the workforce, your management, they're going to boycott you at several points. But understanding, hey, this is the culture that's here. Industry plays a huge role in the way that ministry plays itself out. The inspirations of the city, Paul studied their poets. Obviously could quote them well. The icons of the city, he saw there's an altar with an inscription there. One of the things that's huge when you're going into a city and you're surveying a city, find their major monuments and icons so that you can understand the history behind that. In Detroit, we have this huge statue. Some of you who are Red Wings fans may have seen it in some of our parades when we won, when we win the Stanley Cup. This huge statue, but this man is holding in one hand this sunbeam, and in another hand a family, and in the back there's an inscription where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, and there's a huge history behind that. So if you're going to go into that city, you better study the major icons and statues and monuments of the city. That's huge for D.C., that's huge for New York, that's huge for wherever you're going to go. What are the major landmarks? Paul did that well. And then finally, Emmanuel's work in the city. What is God up to in the city? So if we can, and I'm just giving you a quick overview. Dr. John Feuder does a better job at this in his book, A Heart for the City. Great book, great read. But I would simply say that as much as possible, if we can, incorporate some community exegetical training for our students, that would be great. Let's go on to collaborative leadership. Christian universities should be careful to emphasize to their students the reality that community transformation is a cooperative and mutual work. Effective transformation happens when leaders are able to mobilize, manage, and motivate people towards multi-sector change. So what I'm saying here is that the church has, in the economy of God, it has its limitations and its role. There's also a role for government. There's also a role within the economy of God for the educational sector, the corporate sector, business sector as well. And so how do we get these working together? And I'm saying that our students should be able to at least be catalysts to get people to work collectively together and to think about cooperative change and impact. I list 4 sector leaders: the church, again, networking with other churches and parachurch organizations. In Detroit, we're really proud of the enormous unity that we're experiencing among churches. I've been a part for the past 4 years of a movement called EACH, which is organization stands for Everyone a Chance to Hear, an evangelistic saturation campaign. But 500 churches have come together, and what we found is that in our collective suffering, we lost the luxury of individualism or isolationism. We couldn't work any longer in our own silos and think we were going to win the world. We had to work together. So some of the shifting sentiment in America is going to, I think, actually help. Because if we haven't noticed, the honeymoon of Christianity in America is over. It's officially over. And we enjoyed about 200 years of being the favorite religion in this nation. But I think with the coming persecution will also be accompanied with increased collaboration. Civic leaders consulting with council, local governments. Hopefully we can go into cities and say, we're going to love you well, and we're going to work. Embracing the theology of common grace is huge here. I think that our theology seems to, in an imbalanced way, focus almost exclusively on efficacious grace and not building a robust theology of what does common grace look like as we engage the world. If our God would allow this beautiful 90-degree weather to be enjoyed by sinner and saint alike, shouldn't we show some sense of compassion to the Muslim, to the atheist, to the homosexual in our community? And how does that look? And again, that's why I love the books like what Sean just wrote. But we have to figure out how we wrestle with this whole issue of common grace. And I think this is where we're able to work with the civic sector of our community well, city council, and say what parks need to be cleaned, what neighborhoods can be improved, and can the church or can even Biola as an institution, can we adopt some of these projects, get our students on it so that there's these red shirts all around the city of LA. The corporate community, energizing the business community, business leaders with a vision for the common good. They play a huge role, not just bringing their checkbooks, but these justice issues. I was talking to the pastors last night. When was the last time you heard a sermon at church on fair pricing and how important that is? That's a justice issue. Training employees not to steal supplies from work. Working with the business community to say, how can we leverage our influence? If we haven't noticed, most of the major ethical issues in our society today You can tell who's going to win out just by the way that the corporate community kind of lands on things. And as their dollars flow behind an issue, it really changes the direction of that issue. So mobilizing the corporate world is important. And in the classroom, understanding that public and private schools act as a vital connecting point with families. So all I'm trying to do here is to lay out that we want to help our students to understand, what do I do when I go back home? Because I enjoy being here. I mean, this was like a vacation for me. I mean, I'm from Detroit. So I mean, you're talking about, we got 100 inches of snow this winter. 100 inches. If you want to borrow some, we'll send it, right? So it was beautiful, and I wrestled with God. I said, God, aren't there unbelievers here that need to hear the gospel from my lips? And he said, no, go home. Right? So I'm back home, but when I get back home, this table here didn't go back home with me. Their impact, their influence did, but they physically were here, and now I have to wrestle with, what does this look like? What is all the stuff that I learned in Dr. Smith's class, what does that look like here in Detroit? And how do I make sure that I'm not squandering this amazing grace and education that was afforded to me, and making sure that I maximize it? So all of these things, again, I see as more wraparound that we can either by way of encouragement, influence our students, or maybe even informal, intentional ways, incorporate it in programs and expectation and other structural ways. All right, let's go on 2 more slides and then I'm done. And thanks for staying awake. Counseling and discipleship. These are huge. And it's because, and this is one area that I got to kind of pound the table on, community transformation has to be about people and not just about properties. Because if not, we'll have gentrification where we're moving the bad people out of communities, the good people into communities. And what I've seen in my own hometown and around the country is that it is possible for a community to be restored and the people of that community to be left behind. So this is where counseling and discipleship become very important, because if we want to actually heal people and minister to the brokenness and the wounded heart of people and not just get prettier neighborhoods, then we have to have men and women who know how to counsel and disciple well. Counseling seeks to identify sin and personal character flaws which are leading to relationship dysfunction and destructive behavior. Christian biblical counseling uses the teaching of Scripture to deal with these issues in hopes of resolution and spiritual growth. Since community transformation is ultimately about people, not just about property and buildings, counseling is an essential skill. Now, discipleship, I'm going to use discipleship as a biblical term to describe leadership development. I think New Testament leadership development, this act of producing Christian leaders, if we're looking for that in Scripture, I think discipleship is the biblical term to describe that. Discipleship seeks to systematically develop leaders in key areas of their lives in order to reach full maturity. And I'm going to use this term again, complete leaders, as opposed to people who kind of have one area of strength but not the whole gamut. 6 areas where we want our students to hopefully be proficient in. I want to get you your money's worth, so. 6 areas that we hope our students are proficient in. Number 1, modeling. We need students who know how to model well. This is the first calling of great leaders. Can I model what it is to be a faithful follower of Christ? Then mobilizing. Leaders that don't know how to mobilize will never accomplish anything great. So this is the act of recruiting and positioning people to achieve certain goals. Then mandating, being able to cast a clear direction and vision for people to follow. If a leader doesn't know how to give with clarity and a sense of a compelling passion, a vision and direction, then people will be energized but not know how to deploy that energy. Managing. Strategic planning, execution, and accountability of people. These management skills are what allows massive projects to be accomplished. So what I'm proposing here is that having great philosophical training is not enough if it doesn't translate into our ability to pull off massive community transformation projects, or even small ones effectively. Motivating people, inspiring them towards greater commitment to the vision, and then finally mentoring, teaching others how to become complete leaders and kind of passing that baton on is something we want to encourage. All right, last slide here. And I couldn't come this far and end without a good J.P. Moreland quote. It would be uncivilized. Biblical preaching is the primary tool God has provided for the renewing of the mind of the individual and community to the Christian worldview. I'm a preacher. Maybe you picked that up. And so I understand that this enterprise of biblical preaching is the primary vehicle God has given to us for the renewing of the mind. So producing great communicators who, and when I say that, not just in eloquence, right? Because we have no reason to believe that Jonathan Edwards was a very eloquent speaker by way of the comparisons of charisma that we would use for today in the television, internet, YouTube world. But he was effective nonetheless, and we all know that, right? And so we want communicators who can effectively communicate with compelling compassion and biblical accuracy the teachings of the gospel. Christian universities that are faithful to the task of training students in sound hermeneutics and homiletics will produce community transforming followers of Christ. This is what makes the Christian university distinct, is that we are producing these men and women who can, across kitchen tables and in front of congregations and other individuals in their community, communicate with clarity and with soundness the teachings of the gospel in hopes of the renewing of the mind to the Christian worldview. And I end with this quote. According to Paul, the key to change, this is J.P. Moreland, the key to change is a transformation of a new perspective, or the formation rather, of a new perspective, the development of fresh insights about our lives and the world around us, the gathering of the knowledge and skill required to know what to do and how to do it. And this is where the mind comes in. Truth, knowledge, and study are powerful factors in the transformation of self and control of the body and its habits for a healthy life in the kingdom of God. It's in the renewing of the mind, the formation of a new perspective, that we end up experiencing transformation as individuals. And if we do that as individuals, we can export that into our community. So I just end with saying Biola is phenomenally positioned to be able to be a leading thought leader and impactor on the communities around us. Thank you.
We've got a few minutes for questions, but I'm going to take the opportunity to do the first question, if you don't mind. Chris, tell me what you think of this. How can a place like Biola, which is basically a suburban university, in large part with students who have come from fairly protected suburban backgrounds, how can we have a realistic presence in the city without being naive or wearing out our welcome?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a question I think that sheer demographic shifts in population allocation in our country are going to force us to wrestle with this question more. Within the next 15, 20 years, what we're going to see is that the majority of Americans won't be white suburban Americans. You'll see the increase in Latino, Hispanic, African American influence in this culture, and it's continuing to grow, Asian as well. So this is a great question. I would say you have to approach it from two angles. Number one, you have to have great partners. So as much as possible, connecting with alum or friends of Biola that are serving in these communities it's critical, because anyone who's done global international missions trips understand the host family or the host is critical to the success of that missions trip. If you got a bad host, you're in trouble. It's gonna be bad for the time that you're there. But if you're there on a short-term mission, and you have a host who understands you, your DNA, the way you operate, your needs, your particular aspirations, that missions trip goes well. I would say that's the same for domestic missions work as well. I would also say secondarily, what I'm finding is I go to conferences like the Q Ideas Conference with Gabe Lyons, when I go to CCDA conferences, there is an energy in the hearts of these young, suburban, white evangelical young adults to say, hey, I'm ready to roll up my sleeves. I'm not afraid. I do want to get involved in cities like Detroit and Chicago and LA. And I think that there's a lot of energy there that we can tap into. And what we need to do is just find tracks that are really clearly defined tracks for them to kind of walk in and serve in. So creating programs with good partners for them to take advantage of.
Any other questions?
I was wondering if you could speak to ways that we empower students who do come from the inner city into this largely suburban enclave, to encourage them not to get discouraged and leave.
Yeah.
How do we build a critical mass of students who actually get the city, empower them to teach us as faculty and fellow students to go back to where they're from?
That's great. That's a great question. I was privileged to be able to, again, be a part of Craig Hazen's program here. And what I found is that the profs, just about every one of them, were very open to saying, here's my number, call me. Here's my email me. I always felt access, and I always felt that there was a sense almost of kind of this family connectedness, right? So I think that's huge. What minorities are often intimidated by when you look at universities like Biola, let me just show you the context in which I respond. We have, from Detroit, for the past 5 years conducted, and I don't know if there's another one like this in the nation, a Christian college tour for high schoolers, where we take minority high school students to visit Christian colleges throughout the nation. There's a high concentration on the Midwest, Chicago, Grand Rapids. Those are natural because they're in our own backyard, but we've extended into the South as well, and we're conquering new frontier, moving west, onward. But I say this, hearing those students come back, the colleges that they always are attracted to are the colleges where they had this great sense that you're wanted, you're loved, and there's a sense of family connection here. And what I mean by that is there's a community that will feed you, connect with you beyond just a classroom, right? I think secondarily, helping them to feel comfortable in a practical way is to have a department or an office of multicultural affairs that they have a home. They feel there's a home, that there's dedicated staff. And I don't know if Biola has that. Does Biola already have that? Right? So just knowing there's dedicated staff for me to go to if I have a question or concern that's not just always academic, just more about assimilation, I think that's huge. You know, so continuing some of the structural things you guys are already doing, but just making sure that you go above and beyond and knowing what the moment looks like from a minority student who's looking around the room saying, man, I may just be one of 2 or 3 there in this classroom. You know, I didn't see many black students when I was in my program. I mean, there's been a few more, I know, because they connect with me often. We're a small band of fraternity, if you will, but kind of obligated to call each other. At least they keep the good fight going. But, you know, so sitting in that environment, you're looking around saying, man, I don't see many people that look like me. So just to have the extra affirmation that, hey, we're glad you're here is huge. It doesn't cost anything.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming. I really enjoyed what you had to say. I'm still processing it. A lot of really good information. But could you speak more to some of the questions that these other communities are asking that are outside of the scope of traditional apologetics? And I may need to read your book to get some of these details, but you mentioned like the 5 percenters, and you mentioned like the Black Hebrews or what have you, or other groups. But
yeah, you do got to get the book. So let me just say that. But cheap commercial, sorry about that plug. I would say that the big issue, as you know, that is a part of minority communities is the issue of social justice. Is God a God of justice? And unfortunately, because of the politics that has marked the past decade plus, what we've had is a racial divide over the question of the God of righteousness versus the God of justice. The God who's very ethical and has a high moral standard in the area of life and marriage and religious freedom and liberty, and the God who is concerned about the broken, the poor, the disenfranchised. And so what I'm proposing as a motto that says, righteousness and justice kiss one another. They both make up the foundation of the throne of God. They are integral to his character. We serve a God of justice and righteousness. And so how do we make sure that we don't bifurcate these two things? But how do we take the justice question seriously? How do we take questions like minimum wage seriously? How do we take questions about educational inequalities seriously, right? And wrestle with them in a way that we show respect for the questioner. Because that's the most important act in this process is, again, not just answering the question correctly, but affirming the dignity, the value of the questioner, and the validity of their concern is a big part of the book. But then being able to again, identify their unique questions. So to answer yours more directly, again, the social justice issues and then the religious questions are huge. I mean, we're not dealing with Mormonism in the black community. We're just not. I mean, you got a few. And we know who they are, but we're not dealing with that. You know, so obviously in the last election, you have this candidate who's running that really popularizes the Mormon church and does a lot for making it more mainstream, but that hasn't really hit the black community yet. And you know what else hasn't really hit the black community, even though it's coming, and there's some of the first signs and fruits of it, is humanism. I mean, that really has not been a big part of our struggle. What has been a big part of our struggle is, hey, America has treated us historically very poorly, right? We've not really had a sense of a great love affair with Western culture. So for those who reject Western culture, because evangelical Christianity is so embedded with Western culture, then you end up looking for alternatives to Christianity, and you often try to get some connection back home. And so I could go on and on, but if you're in search, as most African Americans are, if you're in search of identity, because you've been somehow cut off from your past because of slavery and other issues, you often go back to what you think are the religions that represent that. So Egyptology becomes huge, right? The Moorish temple becomes huge, because now this is connecting me to a heritage that's not Western at all. As a matter of fact, it's anti-Western, it's pre-Western, and it's very attractive to me. And it affirms my dignity, even though it uses racism to do that. And it takes, I think, black minority voices to come against that and say, at its foundation, it's a doctrine of devils, it's wrong, it's evil, and we have to combat this with the truth of the gospel and love. But for the rest, you got to get the book. Thanks for the question. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much for a great presentation and outstanding perspectives on the city. Now, my question is more practical and methodological.
Yes.
You take a city like La Mirada. Mm-hmm. The city is very complex. How do you exegete La Mirada without getting lost into all the details and the complexities of the city? Where do you start, and how do you nail down the essential in the study of the city?
Well, I think that I would start with getting a good history book on La Mirada, if there's one that's been written, or my city. I would find a good history book. Then I would ask the basic questions that are associated with missiology. The missionaries have been asking in communities that they service: what's the demographic makeup? Where have the various ethnic groups situated themselves? What is the religious makeup or composite of the community? Again, questions of industry. I would try to become a student and answer, and there's a whole list of questions that I could share with you. The time doesn't permit us to get into right now, but I would learn the history, I would ask those basic critical questions, and then I would begin shaping my engagement or evangelistic endeavor after being informed about those. And a lot of listening. I would just say, with the complexity of the city, that positioning yourself as a listener who's interacting with the residents of this community is really important. You know, there may not be a history book written on La Mirada, but there are some historians that are here in the neighborhood. So connecting with them it can save a whole lot of time, and it's really, really important. And I wouldn't do anything. I mean, in Detroit is a hot spot now for everyone who is hip and missional and wants to rescue a city. And oftentimes they've read 3 articles and seen 2 sound bites, and so they know what we need. right? And they want to come in and with no regard for the established leadership that's already been there, the work of the local church that's there. And I'll be honest with you, they ends up doing more damage than good. So I would talk to leaders that's been here, residents that are here, asking those questions. And once you felt like, man, I understand the hurts, the pains, I use this acronym HDF, hopes, dreams, fears. I want to make sure I know the hopes, the dreams, and the fears of a community. And once I have a sense of that, then I think we can engage. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is also a little bit more practical in the sense that you've already mentioned that Biola is a suburban campus. We've got urban roots, but we moved to the suburbs, right?
Yes, yes.
And I think there's an enormous opportunity to learn from partners in the city. So we've been working through community-based learning. We've had a number of projects going on this year, and some of us have done that for a few years already. Moody's campus in Chicago is urban, right?
It is.
And in Detroit, is it similar?
Suburban.
Suburban.
Yeah.
One of my observations is in community-based learning, adding that on as an expectation for students often has to fight the competition of all the college activities and jobs and so on.
Yeah.
And there's travel time. And so it really is a large commitment when students engage in community-based learning.
Yeah.
Are there practical things you can share with us from your experiences at Moody or
Sure.
about how do you work that into the schedule, or is it an expectation that you add on to all students, or just how do you do that?
It is, and to be honest with you, it's great being engrafted into a culture that's already been established in that way. So I couldn't speak to the wrestlings that took place at strategic points of development with that. It's so ingrained in who we are, especially in Chicago, and I'm working to get that ingrained in Detroit. So I'm kind of wrestling with that more in our Michigan campus now. But I will say that, number one, it's a great asset as you market yourself, being able to say, again, we're not just training great thought leaders, but men and women who know how to effectively lead communities. That's a great marketing feather to have in your cap. I think to the practical administration of it, making space and room and talking with faculty about that endeavor is huge. What we are trying to do right now in Michigan is to just have a group of students who it's obligatory based off of some other incentive. So you're receiving scholarships, so there's an exchange there for you to serve. So everyone who's receiving some type of funding from us, every student, it's an expectation that you serve. And I think students understand that. They don't fight against that. Is it extra work? Sure, but the outcomes are worth the investment there. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but we're fighting through some of that with you.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.